first question, Donna or Julie, how often are MEL scores recalculated while you're on the waiting list? How often are MEL scores recalculated while you're on the waiting list?
So it depends on what your MELD score is at the time of listing, is how often we will repeat or have you go and repeat your lab, so then we can update your MELD score. So if it's higher, if it's between like a MELD of 35 to 40, usually you have to repeat your labs within a week, 7 days. And then going down from there, if your MELD score, let's say, is, for example, 22, usually it's about 2 weeks, then you have to repeat your labs. So it really just depends on what your MELD score is. The lower it is, the less often we have to repeat it.
Okay, short answers, a lot of questions. So controversy about probiotics, should we look, and what should we look for in probiotics?
Absolutely. There is a lot of controversy. I think the more we're learning about the microbiome, probably the more... There is a lot of controversy. I think that it depends on the quality of your product, and unfortunately in the United States there's not a lot of quality standards, so we have done a lot of research and use a couple of specific companies, but the key would be make sure that you're doing it in a decent amount and you're not getting excessive. This is, in America, tends to be, more is better. It's not really that. It's not always the case. And make sure you have a really good, clean source.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, another question about insurance. Do most insurance companies cover functional medicine consultation? And do you have any issues with insurance?
Yeah, so Cleveland Clinic is the first institution to be a insurance-based model. So we're the first group that does take insurance. The only insurances that we don't have success with, unfortunately, is Medicaid and Aetna. We can see you as patients, but the testing isn't covered.
So, thank you. A couple of questions on adjustments to the MEL score. Why aren't there adjustments to MEL scores for PSC? What other problems can be used for exceptions? So, actually, what the MEL did, so before the MEL, there was a different scoring system, and if you had like variceal bleeding or hepatic encephalopathy, it was thought that your prognosis was poorer. But what the MEL did was it showed that complications of liver disease really did not matter as long as your liver was functioning well. So if you recall, the MEL score is based on the bilirubin, the INR test, which is a clotting mechanism, and the creatinine. And so all the adjustments went away, and it was shown that PSC and PBC patients, both of whom are cholestatic, had similar outcomes based on their MEL score. So there are no adjustments for PSC, but depending on your regional review board, as Donna mentioned, if you have cholangitis, then that's an indication. Sometimes you'll get extra points. How do you find a functional doctor in your area? A couple of questions about that.
InstituteForFunctionalMedicine.org is the only one that has this certification for physicians. So you can go on their website and search for a physician in your area.
Okay. What about hepatitis C positive liver from a donor or a high-risk donor? Would any of these be options for patients with lower MEL scores? Do you want to do that, Donna? Or
let me see, make it short. Okay, so we do offer organs of patients that are positive for hepatitis C. It's based on the physician, whether or not the patient will receive a hepatitis C liver. Past, it's hep C into a hep C positive recipient, but now we have a significant increase in hepatitis C positive donors related to the opioid crisis that we are experiencing. So we are very recently have transplanted some non-hep C recipients with hep C donors.
that's the next step. The issue is how do we get insurance companies to pay for treatment of hepatitis C post-transplant. The course of treatment roughly costs about $80,000, so 80. So it's a 3-month course of treatment, so that's going to be the problem. More questions? MEL score adjustment in PSC, yes. So right now, apart from cholangitis, You do not get any other adjustments. Sometimes you can ask for quality of life, and rarely, depending on your local regional review board, you can get adjustments, but it's not part of the MEL score. If you get, if you have cholangiocarcinoma, you do start with higher MEL scores. They start with a MEL of 22, and then every 3 months you get an adjustment. Another question: are real versus lifestyle diseases considered in who gets an organ first? No, they're all treated the same. Dr. Herbst, anything about vitamin K or vitamin D to prevent arterial calcification?
Yes, K1 and K2, and the easiest and the safest way to do that, especially when this patient population, would be through diet. Your dark greens, you have to work with your physician that's willing to watch INR, especially if you're on an anticoagulant. But it is possible, and you are able to do it. It does help with other mineral absorption and vitamin absorption.
And any specific recommendations for PSC patients? I had a question the other day. Is there anything you can do from a dietary standpoint to reduce immunity, to prevent autoimmune diseases?
To decrease the inflammation, yes. So we tend to focus on what's called an autoimmune type focused diet. So that'd be getting rid of things that are what we would say they produce metabolic increased metabolic acidosis, or metabolic ash, a byproduct that's made after the body breaks it down. So you would take away things like refined sugar, all the good foods, by the way, refined sugar, the grain-fed red meats, so you go to grass-fed red meats. You want to decrease caffeine, alcohol. It's all the good things. Sorry.
How much time do we have?
Processed food.
Are we okay for time? Okay. A couple of questions on transplant. I'll try and go through them quickly. Is there a minimum MEL score to get listed? Does this change if a candidate has a living donor transplant? So there's no minimum score to be listed. What studies have shown is that in order to gain benefit from a transplant, your MEL has to be 15 or higher. But there has been a lot of data telling us that even with lower MEL scores, you can still get a benefit. There is a little bit of a disconnect sometimes between MEL scores and complications of liver disease. So sometimes you have patients with encephalopathy and ascites with low MEL scores. But there's actually no minimum MEL score. Sometimes I've had one patient now whose insurance company is denying us listing because his MEL is 7 and 8. So there's not an actual MEL score below which above which you need to be listed. If someone has a living donor with them, again, each hospital has a living donor committee, and we have to convince them, if your MEL is less than 15, that you're actually going to gain benefit from a transplant. So that's the issue if you have a very low MEL score. Question about encountering people who don't want to donate organs or have a misunderstanding that wealthy recipients can buy their way to the top of the list. No, I can assure you that wealth does not play any role. Wealth may play a role in being listed at many centers, and different centers have different waiting times. So if you are wealthy in your own right, or if you have a good insurance program, you can get listed in as many centers as you want. There's no problem with that. Dr. Herbst, does insurance cover the types of tests you order?
Yes, as I said before, all insurance covers the testing that we do. It's standard insurance other than Medicare and Aetna.
Okay, so there's another question about organ donation.
Medicaid, sorry. Medicare covers very well.
A question about organ donation from opting in to opting out. So I think Spain is opting out, so everyone is considered an organ donor unless you opt out, but I don't think that's on the United States. Julie, maybe you can.
State of Ohio, each state has some differences, but they're mostly similar. So Ohio Donor Registry, when you sign up, when you renew your license, you say yes or no. So if you say yes, you've given your consent for donation, and we always recommend you let your family know that. If you do not say yes at the Donor Registry BMV, that doesn't mean a no in the state of Ohio. It just defers your decision to your legal next of kin. So that's why we always encourage to talk about those wishes beforehand.
Okay, some liver transplant questions. If a patient is recommended for an evaluation, what are the odds for board approval for listing, and what are the reasons why someone would not be approved? So the major contraindications to transplantation would be if you have bad heart disease, bad lung disease, if you have cancers outside of the liver or minor cancers of the skin, if you're using alcohol or banned substances such as cannabis and recreational drugs, and if you don't have social support. So these are the things that come up when we say that someone's not a transplant candidate. The heart is a particular concern because in order to go through the operation, your heart has to be really strong. So if you have any kind of heart disease, you may not get listed. Donna, do you or will you give your PSC patients and their families the PSC partners info as a resource?
I would love to.
Okay, good. Can we make sure that you have enough pamphlets and information? Okay, next question. Can international patients receive a transplant in the U.S. based on a U.S. donor? Yes. According to UNOS, we are allowed to transplant 5% of our list with international patients. So that's our quota, so to say. But we do living donors any amount if we have international patients with living donors. Can you talk about hepatic encephalopathy and brain fog? Talk about hepatic encephalopathy issues after transplant. So hepatic encephalopathy is a particular pathophysiological condition where you have confusion and coma as some of the stages, and it's thought to be related to elevated ammonia levels. In spite of extensive research, no other neurotransmitter has been found to play a role, and that specifically is called hepatic encephalopathy. I'm not quite sure what you mean by brain fog, but there are a few patients who have subclinical hepatic encephalopathy where they don't actually manifest the earliest clinical form of hepatic encephalopathy. But if you do psychometric testing, actually one of the ways to do it is to put them in a car driving simulator and have them drive a car and see how many accidents they have. So if you do neuropsychometric testing, you'll find that they make a number of mistakes. So that's a condition called subclinical hepatic encephalopathy that sometimes, I guess could be called brain fog. Most of the time, hepatic encephalopathy will go away, and it should go away after a liver transplant. Rarely, if you have large shunts that persist after transplant, you may have persistent hepatic encephalopathy, but usually that can be treated. Okay, Dr. Hurst, how do you feel about taking probiotics as opposed to eating probiotic or probiotic foods?
Definitely like the idea of getting it through food. Homemade yogurt is probably your best. If you put a bunch of sugar, unfortunately, they'll have certain colony counts in it before they added the sugar, and then it's less viable. And so really it's kind of confusing advertisement in a lot of the commercial yogurts. But if you can make your own, that would be fantastic, yeah.
And is there something that can be taken to help memory and brain function post-transplant? Vitamins, anything for chronic pain?
Yeah, so there are several things you can do for chronic pain. One of the things that comes to mind, especially if I'm thinking of someone with liver disease, would be turmeric. We use that a lot at the cancer treatment center I worked at in Oklahoma. But you can use curcumin, which is the bioactive ingredient of turmeric. That's a great one for inflammation and pain. The other is Boswellia serrata. It's an herb that is pretty well documented to be a pain reliever. It's a good source. Let's just make sure you have a good source.
Okay, very quickly. Would it change your place in the transplant waiting list if you had a living donor? Yes, it would. So you don't actually wait for your turn on the list. You can get your transplant whenever you can. If there is such a problem with the MELD and PSC, PBC, why don't they reevaluate it? That's, as I said, the MELD has shown to be the best way to determine survival on the waiting list. So if you have complications, then you have to kind of appeal to the regional review board or have a living donor. Another question for Dr. Hurst. My daughter is very interested in your department. Costs are astronomical. Do you make your services available to people with limited resources?
Yes, as long as you have insurance. I think the insurance is key because it helps cover a lot of the cost. The average cost of our specialty test out of pocket to patients is about $150, which really isn't that bad.
Okay, and if diagnosed with metastatic cancer after 8 years, one lung nodule, can you get a liver transplant? It depends on what type of cancer it is and what the risk of recurrence is. So I would suggest whoever asked that question, go to your local transplant center and ask them. IBD patients, any food specifically to reduce inflammation?
For IBD, I would say the probiotics and prebiotic foods, so artichokes, onions, garlic, those would be amazing.
Okay, Donna, last question.
I tried to keep it short.
Donna, transplant, anyone with a high BMI here? Acceptable BMI for transplant?
We do. We don't really have a cutoff. If they do have a very high BMI, we'll suggest if they have a lower MELD score, if they could lose some weight prior to transplant.
The number 50 has been delicately suggested
Yes.
by our surgeons as an upper limit. So with that, I'd like to close the session. Thank you all.